So it's my pleasure to introduce Kitty.
Thank you. Thank you, Hillary and Eileen, and to the JCC Chicago Film Festival for inviting me here this evening. You know, it's always an honor to be able to share this story about my family, and I'm so grateful to you for including me tonight. As you'll see, I will be talking a little bit about Switzerland, not so much directly connected to the film, but my dad's experience in Switzerland during the war. But let's get started. I'll give you a little background. In 2014, I had an adult B'nai mitzvah. It was a few years later than my 13th birthday, but I decided that it was on my bucket list. I wanted to do it. But I was struggling with articulating the personal meaning of my Devar Torah, which had to do with the Israelites traveling through the Promised Land, through the wilderness to get to the Promised Land. So remember that term, the Promised Land. And as I began to think about traveling in the wilderness, it struck me that my father's and mother's life was similar to the Israelites' experience. And this evening, I honor my parents and all survivors who found life after seeing the worst in humankind. We are all on a journey. Isn't that what life is, with twists and turns and unexpected stops along the way? We're all travelers. Sometimes we think we're going in one direction, only to be surprised by going in another. My dad, Karl Loewy, or Charles as he preferred, was a young man in Vienna, Austria in the 1930s. Born in 1919, he was the only child to Arpad and Barbara Cohen Loewy. And he was your typical kid. He skied and he played soccer and was a terrific swimmer. He had a bar mitzvah, he attended high school, and he planned to attend university and hopefully study engineering. Now, I can't tell you too much about my Viennese grandmother, Barbara. I know she had several sisters whom my dad was very fond of, along with a number of cousins. My grandfather, Arpad, was originally from Slovakia. He served in the Austro-Hungarian army and he worked in the garment industry. Always the dapper-looking man, as I recall, as you can see here. He and Barbara married in their late 20s. Vienna, at the turn of the 20th century, was a bustling city of 2 million people. It was a very vibrant place. The birthplace of the great composers Mozart and Schubert. It was the home of Sigmund Freud and was considered a world leader in science, philosophy, and research. And it was also a melting pot of immigrants from across the empire. But things began to change in the 1930s. The entry of Hitler's army into Austria in March of 1938 triggered terrible suffering and hardship for Vienna's Jews. Home to 180,000 Jews, men and women were grabbed at random by Nazis and jailed for no reason, while police turned a blind eye to the looting of Jewish homes and businesses. The occupation of Austria, known as the Anschluss, reached its peak over 2 days in November 1938, when Kristallnacht, Night of Broken Glass, saw the Nazis destroy every synagogue in Vienna and arrest 6,000 citizens. Most of those arrested would be sent to Dachau. Jews were gradually robbed of all their freedoms. They were blocked from almost all professions. They were shut out of schools and universities and forced to wear the yellow badge that identified them as a Jew. One day, a knock on the door changed everything for my dad's family. A member of the police told my dad and grandfather to leave the city. They were given just a couple of days to vacate. No longer considered a rightful citizen of the city that he loved, my 18-year-old dad left his mother behind, who told him things would blow over soon, not to worry, the women and children would be safe. and he set out on an unexpected, unknown journey. Sarah Miriam Kweskin was born on the north side of Chicago in 1919, the child of Polish-born Tauba Kesselman and Lithuanian-born Jack Kweskin. Life was not easy for Sarah and her brother Sam. The family struggled financially, and the passing of her father in 1933, when Sarah was just 14, left the family in deep debt. Foregoing her education, Sarah dropped out of Roosevelt University, or Roosevelt High School, I should say, to go to work for an uncle. She would live at her Chicago home with her mother until she was 27, when her journey would bring her to an unexpected place. Well, after that fateful knock on the door in 1938, Charles set off with a friend, hoping to get to neutral Switzerland, where they felt they might be safe. At one point, after several days of travel through unfamiliar towns and villages and sleeping in barns and forests to avoid being caught, my dad's friend demanded that they travel in a new direction. My father resisted, knowing that his friend was scared and tired and frustrated. I mean, who wouldn't be? The next morning upon awakening, his friend had abandoned him and stolen the few items my dad had taken on his trip. Eventually, though, using his own wiles, my dad made it to Switzerland and found work in camps that were set up by the Swiss government. The friend was never heard from again. There you see my dad with a bunch of other workers. The Swiss camps paid Jewish workers a pittance for backbreaking work. The men were used to clear the roads, to chop down trees, and to help the local farmers. But they weren't incarcerated. He was able to come and go as he pleased. A few years ago, I asked the Illinois Holocaust Museum to translate a diary of my dad's. What I found was eye-opening, and I'll be reading excerpts throughout my presentation. Here's one from April 1st, 1940. Charles was 20 years old. It's the first day at the Swiss work site. I think you can tell from my handwriting, this work is difficult. It's extremely difficult. A few days ago, part of the forest was so destroyed by a storm that the pine trees snapped like matches. Our job is to remove the soil from the roots so that the foremen are able to saw through the trunk without getting their blades caught. Of course, I feel completely exhausted, but I'm starting to work on my plan to emigrate to Brazil. I hope it works out. I'm too tired to think right now. As I read my dad's diary, I can feel the worry and confusion and fear in his words. Here's another excerpt from May 10th, 1940. The Germans marched into Holland and Belgium. Switzerland has mobilized for battle. We found this out this afternoon and left the work site in an organized fashion. People are tense. We heard that bombs were dropped in the Jura Mountains. We're expecting internment. What's going on with Papa? I'm pretty nervous. I hope he's with the French. To make matters worse, our radio isn't working, but I'll write more later. It turned out that his dad, in fact, was being detained in France. Here he writes the first week of June, 1940. Personally, I'm completely wiped out. This is probably the most difficult work I've ever done in my whole life. The future prospects look so dim that it's best not to even think about it. The biggest battle of the war thus far has been raging since yesterday on the Western Front. The German army is attacking with 1.5 million men and 3,000 tanks. The French are retreating. Paris and Berlin have been bombed. The complete occupation of France is expected. I received some mail from Papa. He's in a camp in the south of France. The Japanese are continuing their killing in China. And Charles writes this in mid-July. After a long while, I finally received a letter from Papa again. The tone of the letter was so depressing that I now too feel down. He's in a camp with thousands of other refugees and had to write the letter while standing up, since that's all the space he had. He's asking me to do everything possible to get him out of the camp. I'm going to Zurich tomorrow, and I will do everything I can. Finally, late summer 1940, my dad receives news that the American Jewish Joint Distribution Commission has arranged for a group of refugees to immigrate to the Dominican Republic, a primitive, undeveloped jungle island in the Caribbean. In late July, Charles writes, "The past week has been tough. I've decided to go to Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic. What awaits me and my compatriots there is a mystery, but one thing is clear. I have to say adieu to Europe and my parents. I'm worried about how Papa is going to take the news, but if my emigration goes well, I might be able to bring Mama and Papa over. And I'm doing everything I can to get out of this camp. The ship leaves August 19th. However, all sorts of things can happen between then and now." So a little background on the Dominican Republic. You should know that in 1938, 32 leaders of countries from around the world held a special meeting in Evian, France, to figure out what to do with the Jews that were leaving Europe. Most of these countries, including the US, decided that they did not want immigrants coming to their country. They were sympathetic to the Jews, but they would not welcome them, except for one man who was the president of the Dominican Republic. His name was Rafael Trujillo, and he said that 100,000 Jews were welcome to come to his country. Trujillo was a brutal dictator who murdered his own countrymen. He's accused of being responsible for up to 67,000 deaths. It's said that the only reason he invited the Jews to enter the country was to whiten the population. His hope that the Jews and the natives would intermarry. Trujillo was president from 1930 until 1961, when he was assassinated. Well, from Switzerland, Charles traveled through France, where he was able, fortunately, to visit his father. And then he traveled to Lisbon. While in Lisbon, he received this postcard from his mother. Barbara writes to her son on October 17th, 1940. "My very dear child, I hope these few lines reach you. Stay healthy and optimistic. Trust yourself and don't let things annoy you. Maybe you'll be with him soon. Stay brave and strong and know that your mother is thinking of you often. Safe travels. Love, Mom." Well, a few months later, on March 12th, 1941, Barbara and about 1,000 other Viennese Jews were sent to the Opatov ghetto in Poland. We know this because the International Tracing Service helped us track down the transit information. The Germans, as you know, were very good at keeping records. Conditions in the ghetto, of course, were very difficult. My grandmother, Barbara, was already an older woman at this point. She was in her 50s, and we don't know if she survived that camp or died at Treblinka, which was a death camp that was the end of the road for anyone on that March transport. We will assume that her sisters and nieces and nephews perished as well. A few weeks later, on November 12, 1940, my dad boarded a boat called the Guinée, which first made a stop at Ellis Island. My dad had gotten ill while on the ship and they wouldn't let him finish the trip to the Dominican Republic. So he had to disembark on Ellis Island for medical care. Here's what he said about Ellis Island. "Ellis Island is a comfortable prison. You stay in a huge hall during the day. There are tables and armchairs for us to sit in and clothes racks for our luggage. At the moment, there are about 100 people here. Some are Jews, mainly refugees from Poland and Germany who were driven from their homes by a crazy man, young and old, a movie magnate from Paris, no more important than a salesman from Germany. Some have been here for 3 or 4 months already and are waiting to see if they can immigrate. Men and women sleep in separate dorms. Life here reminds me of being in the camp in Switzerland, but under much better conditions. There's plenty of food, and it's good. Well, after 2 weeks at Ellis Island, he was able to set sail on another ship, which first took him to Puerto Rico and then onto the Dominican Republic. The Dominican Republic government welcomed the Jews on the condition that they become agricultural workers, farmers, basically. The Joint Distribution Committee created a special organization called the Dominican Republic Settlement Association and funded it to purchase 26,000 acres in the Dominican town of Sosua, which had previously been developed as a banana plantation, but then was abandoned by the United Fruit Company. Upon arrival, every Jew was given several acres of land, cows, a mule, and a horse. The Dominican Republic Settlement Association brought in agricultural specialists from Palestine and trained the refugees to farm. Many Jews became experts in dairy production and cheese making, but the program ended in October 1941 when no one was able to travel due to Nazi restrictions. In the end, less than 700 Jews would find freedom in the Dominican Republic. And my dad, seen there on a horse, was lucky to be one of them. My grandfather, Arpad, survived the French work camps. He was also able to make it to the Dominican Republic and then eventually to the US in 1946. So let's get back to Sarah Queskin, this lady, the Chicago girl. She was now Sally, as she decided that Sarah did not suit her. Her mother, Taba, or Tilly, as I knew her, was at heart a matchmaker, and she was also concerned about her daughter's marriageability. One day, probably in late 1947, while shopping at a dress store in Chicago, she happened upon a dapper-looking man and started up a conversation about their children. It probably went something like this. Tilly, I have an unmarried daughter. Oi, she's 27. Arpad, the dapper-looking seller of women's clothes, probably responded, here's the address of my son. Maybe they can write to each other. I'm sure they have much in common. And so Sally began a pen pal relationship with a refugee in the jungle of the Dominican Republic, and thus began the start of a new journey. What they wrote about, what she told him about her life, what he told her about his, can only be imagined. Sally, deciding to throw caution to the wind, made arrangements to fly to the Dominican Republic to meet this man, this stranger in a strange land. Can you imagine? This was 1948. On February 1st, she took the longest trip of her life. And on February 14th, in a Spanish language ceremony, she said, "Sí," when asked if she took this man in matrimony. My mom would tell me how during that ceremony, she had no idea what the Spanish officiant was saying, only that my dad elbowed her every time she needed to say "sí." They both settled in Chicago in the summer of 1948 and had a son the following year, my brother Jack, and I came along a few years later. My parents were married for 51 years. My dad passed in 1999 and my mom in 2012. Isn't it funny where your journey can take you? The story of the 700 survivors is a little known one. Think of what those European refugees must have thought when they landed in the Caribbean, the promised land. They created lives for themselves by learning to farm the jungle, build homes, celebrate the high holidays, find freedom, and leave a legacy that I am proud to be a part of. 2 years ago, we were honored to be asked to be part of the museum's, the Holocaust Museum's wonderful exhibit called Stories of Survival, which showcased survivors of many different conflicts around the globe. we created a poster with the handprints of 9 of the great-grandchildren of Charles and Sally, which of course showcased their legacy. Now, 11 great-grandchildren later, we know they would be very happy to see the family flourish. I did a little research on the Dominican Republic to bring you up to date on what is there today. According to Wikipedia, 3,000 Jews reside in both the capital, Santo Domingo, and in Sosúa. There are 3 synagogues there, including a Chabad. The Chabad Outreach Center focuses on assisting the local Jewish population to reconnect with their Jewish roots, and it's a source for traditional Judaism in the Dominican Republic. In Sosúa, there's a small Jewish museum next to the synagogue. On the high holidays, the Sosúa community hires a cantor from abroad who comes to lead services. The survivors of the war who lived in the DR in the 1940s used to hold reunions. I remember my parents attending in 1990. They just loved seeing their old friends. So I have a few more slides here. Here is a picture of a customs slip that declares what my dad brought in from the Dominican Republic on July 3rd, 1948. If you look closely, you can see he brought in 480 cigarettes, but I don't see a declaration of a wife. The next slide is a letter from the Dominican Republic Settlement Association that acknowledges my dad's expertise in agriculture. It's dated 1944 and appears to be a reference letter, perhaps for another position he was looking for in the Dominican Republic. This slide is an interview that he and my mom did back in 1986 for the Sun Sentinel news paper in Florida where they had settled. And this next slide is the one that the museum used to promote a talk that I gave several months ago. It's a picture of a couple, obviously farming. They were on the cover of this book called Dominican Haven. And the book was created for an exhibit that was shown, I believe, at the Jewish Heritage Museum in New York. This couple is Rosa and Heinz Lesser. They came to the DR in 1940 from Berlin. They had recently sent their 3 children, ages 3, 6, and 9, on the Kinder transport to Sweden. In this picture, Rosa is 28, Heinz is 31. They wouldn't see their children again for 10 years. As it turns out, the granddaughter of this couple is a very close friend of mine, and her mother was one of the kids on the transport that went to Sweden. So it's just interesting, all the connections that I've made regarding the Dominican Republic. But may all of their memories be a blessing. And I think there's an interesting conversation that we can have about the Dominican Republic, because it was ruled by a despot, but he saved people and offered to save 100,000 people. So there's a moral and ethical question to ask ourselves about Rafael Trujillo and what he did. So he murdered his own people and yet saved the Jews, and I'm here to have testimony about that. So anyway, that is my presentation. I thank you all for listening. I hope you learned something and enjoyed it too.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that story. I'm taking notes because I'm going to find somebody who can talk about this with you. Maybe I'll find somebody. I'm good at that kind of research. So can you tell us a little bit about your dad's connection to Switzerland and how we sort of came to have you talk for us about Labyrinth of Peace?
Yeah, so, the best that I can tell you is that Switzerland at the time was considered a neutral country where people could go, but apparently he went and found this farm, this multiple farms, because he worked on 2 of them, that allowed people to, and they were all Jews who were working on these farms. They weren't being carted off. They weren't being arrested. They were working practically free for farmers and other people. And that's all I can tell you. And, it's very interesting because I try to do more research on these settlements in Switzerland that use these Jewish workers. And I can't find information about what they were called or how long they lasted, but he was in 2 different ones for 2 years. So
I wonder if you can't find anything because the neutral country of Switzerland might be a bit ashamed of, what they did based on what we saw in this movie.
Yes,
in
but
this series.
I don't know if this camp was sanctioned by the government or it was farmers who allowed people to come in and work for practically free, almost like slave labor. So that's the piece that we all wish that our parents were here so that we could ask more questions. All I have is that diary, and thankfully I have it, that gives me some information about his time in Switzerland. Obviously, it was very difficult work, but he wasn't imprisoned. So he was able, he went to Zurich. He was trying to get papers for his father, and I think he eventually was able to get papers that allowed his father to get to the Dominican Republic. Remember, only 700 people went out of a quota of 100,000. Imagine if 100,000 could have gotten there. So,
so did your dad talk about these things, or you really found out mostly after you had the diary translated?
Yeah, and like in so many families, the story is similar, where there is little talked about. And as a kid, how would I didn't know what I didn't know, and I didn't know what to ask what I didn't know. And it wasn't something that was, talked about comfortably around the dinner table. So it was, I think as we mature, we get older and we become more interested in family and ancestry and our parents. We didn't stop to think, why do all the people around my parents' table speak with an accent? Why did they whisper sometimes? What were they talking about? It took me until I was much older to figure it out and to want to do the research, that if I could go back 30 years, I'd be smarter. I'd be telling you more information today.
Kitty, we interviewed an author. It was Aspeth, I think is her name, right?
Yes.
Elizabeth Aspeth. And she's written books about the Jews who went to Sweden.
Mm-hmm.
And the interesting thing is, they were also allowed to come in to do agricultural work. So one of the books that she wrote about was about a friend of the guy who founded IKEA, actually. And he came as a young boy, right before, you could no longer send somebody over the border. His parents sent him to Sweden as a youngster. And he lived, as I recall, kind of like in kind of like an orphanage of with other young Jewish children until he was old enough to be kind of literally farmed out to do labor.
Yeah.
And that's how he got to meet the guy who who discovered IKEA. He worked on the farm that the IKEA man, his father owned.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's interesting to me that it's such a similar story.
The agriculture. So Trujillo wanted his country developed, and he figured that he would whiten his population. The European males coming into the country would, connect with the natives that lived there, and somehow whitening the population was seen as
Positive.
a positive thing. The interesting thing about what did happen in the Dominican Republic was there were a number of Jews that did stay, and they started big dairy farms, and cheese production became a huge output of the Dominican Republic, dairy, cheese. And the people who settled there, the Jews that settled there, that did intermarry and buy up land, they became very successful. Very successful. So,
Do we have any more questions in the audience? I know Susan asked, when Charles arrived in the Dominican Republic, I assume he didn't speak the language. How did he and your mom learn the language?
so my dad actually had a pretty good grasp on multiple languages. He spoke German, he spoke Spanish, he spoke French, he spoke Yiddish. So he was able to connect with the Dominicans without any problem. My mother, on the other hand, was completely lost, as you could tell from the ceremony, when she had no idea what she was agreeing to.
So they got married in a civil ceremony, not in a.
Oh yeah, they got married in a civil ceremony. She stayed for about 6 weeks. He was not able to leave with her, so she left, I believe, the end of March, and he came in July once his papers were in order.
And so what did they do what did your dad do when he came to the United States?
Well, he was doing textiles and agriculture. He was picking sweet potatoes in the DR. When he came to the States, there really was not a need for anyone picking sweet potatoes. My dad had hopes of going into engineering one day, but and going to university, but once he left Vienna, that was sort of dashed. So he ended up coming to Chicago and getting a job selling aluminum siding or awnings, and that was the kind of work he was repairing. Here's an interesting, he was trained by Ort to repair typewriters. So he did some typewriter repairing on the side. What I can't tell you, I don't know if he learned that in the DR or if Ort taught him that once he came to Chicago, but shout out to Ort for helping him learn how to fix typewriters.
Eileen, do you want to chime in? Because your in-laws, right, are, you have to unmute.
Hillary?
Yeah, my in-laws were from they were from closer to the Dutch border. After Kristallnacht, my father-in-law went to Dachau. My mother-in-law worked in the, she didn't work, my mother-in-law was involved with Youth Aliyah. She came from a more rural area, and she used to bicycle people and money over the Dutch border into Holland. And but during the day, they were training young Jewish people from the city so that they could go to Palestine and work in those days. It was Palestine, and so that they could be agricultural workers, because these people came from the city. They had no idea what they were doing. But my father-in-law's family, they owned lumber mills, and And so when my in-laws came over to the United States, they did the same. They sold siding and soffit. And so my husband to this day has that business. But
Yeah.
but it's so funny when you said that, he that's what he knew.
Right.
That was
Right.
what he knew. He knew
My-
the building trades.
And my dad ended up building homes in the south suburbs and worked for Centex Construction Company, which was a big company. Well, I don't even know if it's still around, but he built homes. So he went into construction. That really became his career. So
I think Frank has a question.
hi, Frank.
Let me shed some light on Sosua. My wife and I lived in the Dominican Republic a few times. First time we went there, we went to Sosua. It has a museum, has a synagogue. If you make arrangements, you can get a tour of both of them for a very small sum. And there's a complete history of the Jews in Sosua. Incidentally, in the airport at Puerto Plata, there's a whole wall, or at least it used to be, a whole wall mural of Rafael Trujillo, as I say. He was not a nice guy, but he did. He was the only one who was willing to take Jews at the Evian conference. That they came there. Now, 700 went, because you've got to remember, at that time, Jews who until October 21 of 41, you could emigrate, you could leave Germany, but you had to go someplace. Most people wanted to go to a place that was more urbanized. So Sua, after all, was, as Katie pointed out, a jungle. And to live in a semi-tropical jungle, non-existing or only partially existing agricultural community was not exactly a career choice at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. But but at the end of the day, Frank, these 700 people were happy to be alive.
Yeah.
And I call it the promised land because they found freedom and no one was persecuting them there. So
I think Perón as well, also being a dictator. We had watched a film about him and how they also, Argentina took in Jews. There's a huge Jewish population in Argentina. We know quite a few people from there. So, maybe these dictators were trying to make up for all the bad things they were doing to their own people. Probably not, but who knows?
Well, actually not.
No, he think not.
No, they had ulterior motives. The three individuals who probably saved more Jews than any other individual were three labored anti-Semites. Admiral Horthy, Count Boris of Bulgaria, and Francisco Franco of Spain.
Right.
Anti-Semites, but for their own reason, for their own, I would say, national prestige and so on, they saved more Jews than any of the other individuals who we recognize as doing it out of the goodness of their heart. They did it for other motives, but they did it.
But Frank, don't you think it's interesting that there was this opportunity? Look, if in 1941, you had to see the handwriting on the wall if you were, like if you were in Germany and you were Jewish. And
in 1941, by October 41, you couldn't leave anymore.
right. It was 1938.
so don't you think it's interesting that more people didn't leave? I mean, anything had to be better than what was happening there.
People were trying to leave, but in most cases, they didn't want to. The Dominican Republic was not at the top of the list. They were trying to get to Argentina, they were trying to get to Brazil, they were trying to get to Uruguay, They were trying to get, obviously, the United States, anywhere in the British Empire, anywhere in Europe, that the neutral countries of Europe, none of whom really wanted them. So Sosua was a possibility, but you also have to remember the Joint Distribution Committee that funded this also interviewed people. And if you, for instance, if I had at my age had applied to go to Sosua, they would have turned me down. They said you'd never be able to make it. It's a subtropical or semi-tropical country. It is a well, very primitive life. You've got to be able to be young and be able to do the kind of work that's necessary.
Yeah, and they were, and interestingly, they were given the tools to be able to do that work. They were given land, and they were given horses and cows and.
Kitty, I actually had another question. I'm sorry, Frank, to interrupt you. So your dad was for a period of time on Ellis Island, and there was nobody who would accept him, who would say he's here and try and get him off the island and into New York.
Oh, he was not, so because of the medical issue, he was restricted to stay on Ellis Island. I don't know that he would have had a connection with anyone in New York, and I think his papers probably indicated that he was set to go to the Dominican Republic. But isn't it interesting that he was a stone's throw from America?
It's a very short boat ride from Ellis Island to the mainland. I mean, I grew up there, so there's an
he could almost touch it, but I think he was resolved that he was going to the DR, and that's where he was going, and he was there for 7 years. So he lived there a long time.
Yeah.
Remember the St. Louis?
Yes.
After all, that was in sight of Ellis Island, was inside of the Statue of Liberty. People had visa quotas that would, for the following year, they were not permitted to go in. Coast Guard cutters made sure that nobody jumped ship and got into that. It was virtually impossible for somebody to jump the quota. The quotas were sacrosanct, and by this time, it was Breckinridge Long who was administering them. And if you really want an anti-Semite, that's the one to do.
Did anybody else have any more questions for Kitty about her dad's journey? Eileen, do you have any other?
No, but it's a fascinating story. And the fact that your father wrote a diary, like, wow. What?
And it wasn't taken by the friend who abandoned him. I mean, that was the other piece that he had that on his trip and was able to continue writing. So, yeah.
We do have another question. So Eve wanted to know what happened to the land in the Dominican Republic after your father came to the US? Because it was his land, right? Like they gave it to each person.
Yeah, but I think it was more like you're given it, but I don't think you owned it. You're given it, you're a tenant there. And so you're able to farm and do and whatever and live there. But I mean, that land today, it could very possibly be giant farms or giant dairies. Of course, part of the Dominican Republic is a big resort area, not around Sosua, I think on the other coast. I don't know that there's a lot around Sosua. I'm sure it's a little bit more developed than it was in 1942. But
have you been there?
It's another one of those bucket list places. But I had heard, like Frank talked about how he was able to go and visit the synagogue and the museum. I had also heard from other people that it's really run down in that area and there wasn't much to see. But now you've sort of piqued my interest, Frank, and I would like to do that. I should, right? I should. It's part of my legacy. I should go there for sure.
Excellent. Well, Kitty, thank you so much. What an interesting story. We're gonna have to find out some more about it. See if there's a film about this little little town in the Dominican Republic, right?
Yeah,
So-
anytime. I'm happy to talk to anyone more about it. It's an absolute pleasure to do this for all of you, and I thank you very much for including me tonight.
It's our pleasure.
Thank
Eileen
you.
and I are super lucky. We get to meet so many people and we get to learn so many amazing things. Like Eileen says all the time, we think we've seen everything. We think we know about every story there could possibly be. And then another one comes out. So
Did anyone know, other than Frank, did anyone else that's on screen tonight know about the Dominican Republic? Because it is one of those little stories, but it's a big little story.
Right.
yeah, for sure. Well, we're excited to let everybody know that on November 5th, our next film festival will start, our fall film festival. So we've got 3 weekends of films. We're showing 8 films, all different genres, a lot of documentaries, heavy documentaries, but really, really interesting stories. So please visit our website, jccchicago.org, for more information on the film festival. Kitty, thank you again. Frank, we were thrilled to have you last night. Thank you for sharing a few more thoughts this evening. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us. Take care and be well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a good evening.
You too.